Hey there, welcome to an interesting old man yells at the sky. I'm not going to rant this time because this one is a little different. If you listen to our last old man yells at the sky, it was on cultural appropriation in games, and we talked at length about that specific topic. I gave some examples of cultural appropriation, and part of that episode was an interview with Dr. Amanda Morris, who specifically talked with us about indigenous uh, gaming and because that is her area of expertise. And we sat down and we talked about it at length, and we had a really great discussion. And Amanda is also the co-host and producer of Inside 254 podcast. And one of the things she just did recently was sit down. She went to New Mexico and sat down with Dr. Lee Francis IV. He is the creator and owner of Native Realities Press. He is the co-owner of Red Planet Books and Comics and the founder of Indigenous ComicCon. And essentially what she did was she sat down with him and talked about specifically the voice of indigenous peoples in comic books, in gaming, in pop culture, which tells you the title of the old man yells at the sky tells it all. And she sat down with him and talked with him about this and why it's so important. And this is essentially a follow up to our initial Old Man Yells at the Sky cultural appropriation in games. So we were lucky enough that she shared this interview with us. It was also released on their podcast, the Inside 254 podcast, as an expert extra, which is a segment that they do when they highlight specific experts in their fields. They shared this with us. They asked us to share it with the rest all of our listeners. And it's an amazing interview. It's great. A lot of good information, especially if you want to learn more about indigenous peoples and what they do and how they contribute to pop culture and how they need to have more equity and have a seat at the table, essentially, when it comes to all of these things, more so than just the consultant basis on games and things like that. They need to be able to actually sit there and make it all happen. And Lee Francis is somebody who believes that wholeheartedly and talks about it at length and talks about why he created all these things to help that process along. So I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to sit here and tell you about the whole interview. I want you to listen to it. So we want to thank Amanda and Colleen, who are both the hosts for Inside 254, for allowing us to share this interview. I want to thank Dr. Lee Francis for also giving permission for us to have this on our show. And also, as always, we want to thank you, the listener. We hope that this helps to educate you. It helps to inspire some of your thought processes on how games, especially since this is a gaming podcast, how games can also help in this process. And we hope that you're just inspired in general, because that's what we want to do. So with that, again, welcome to this follow-up of Old Man Yells at the Sky. Enjoy.
I'm sitting here today with Dr. Lee Francis IV, a self-described indigenerd poet, activist, educator, and comic creator. Lee's family is from Laguna Pueblo, correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. And he has created 3 businesses that focus on creating, disseminating, and celebrating Indigenous comics. Lee owns Red Planet Books and Comics in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we're sitting right now. Ooh. He also founded Native Realities Press, which is a publisher focused on Indigenous creators and characters in comics and books, including 2 of our favorites on the podcast, Dear Woman Anthology and Six Killer. Oh, absolutely amazing wonderful comic. I can't wait for the second one. 3 years ago, Lee also started Indigenous ComicCon, which is going strong, and it runs again this November, yes?
Yep.
Okay. So Lee, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So I want to start actually with your story.
Sure.
You clearly love this medium, right? So there's some love here. When did you first become interested in comics?
Yeah, that's a great question. The mythology that I like to tell is that I remember one of the first experiences that I had was here in Albuquerque at Duran Central Pharmacy, right down here on Central. They had an old spinner rack, and my dad and I used to go down there for lunch or breakfast and whatnot, and I would be able to pick out one of the comics that was there on the spinner rack. And so I was a huge Marvel fan growing up. And you know, when we were growing up, I remember stopping at comic shops when I was a kid, and I remember, you know, just various opportunities picking up comic books here, there, and everywhere. My folks got me comics. It wasn't a super obsession, but it was just something that naturally developed. It was part of my life, and it was part of my lifeblood. I don't think I went full comic collector nerd, although I did collect comics. It wasn't something that was necessarily a huge component of like my identity. I didn't identify as like a comic nerd. I was just kind of a general nerd, I want to say. My dad was an early adopter of technology. We had a TRS-80 in the house, so I played video games.
Oh wow! And, yeah, old school.
My dad was, my dad loved pop television, so all of those old shows that we now all reminisce about, I was up on that, and music and etc. So all of those pop culture genres was what factored into all of my identity and existence, and then family members playing role-playing games, and all of these pieces were very critical to my growing up, and that doesn't rule out. I was one of those rare nerds. I did athletics. I liked to run and play football and do all these other things, and I wasn't the star or whatever, but I enjoyed my moments and my time with that. So there was a lot of pieces with that. But those early days at Duran's, my dad never had a problem with comics. I know that I've heard stories of people that have their family's like, oh, those are terrible. And my dad, if I was reading, my dad was very excited. And so that was one of the key memories that I have when I grew up about coming into this world of comic books and popular culture and whatnot.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that. When did you first see yourself as an Indigenous person represented in a non-stereotypical way in a comic book?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because I'm not entirely sure that I can remember that. Where I remember seeing it very distinctly and clearly was Predator, in terms of popular culture. So the Predator movie, Billy Soul is the native character that's in that. And he is the first guy to recognize the threat of the Predator, because he has traditional stories from his people. The Predator, when the Predator comes, they hunt the greatest warriors on Earth, right? Or the greatest warriors in wherever they do, because that's the whole part of the Predator's hunt. And so Billy has these traditional stories that have been passed down from him about how the Predators came down in pre-colonial times. He's the last one on the Earth space, to last within that particular show, into the movie itself. So that one was really dynamic for me, because you saw Billy, and here he is, he's standing on the bridge, and he's cutting himself, and and he's the last one to face the Predator before Arnold gets to him, and he gets the Predator's, ultimate, award of he gets his skull and spine ripped out, which is the Predator's oh, you're a worthy warrior. But he has no feathers. He has no, there's no fringe. He's one of the soldiers. He's one of the regular guys. And he's a badass. And that, for me, was probably the first time that I recognized it. I don't think I recognized it really in comic books. And now I've seen more comic books. Mostly because I just missed some of the comic books because I was really a mainstream comic kid. Mm-hmm. So I remember seeing folks like Forge in the X-Men, Danny Moonstar from some of those early ones, but they were I won't say they were stereotypical, but there were particular tropey aspects to their characters. There was a lot, Forge wore a lot of fringe, with the moccasins and the dangly stuff, and when he was being native, there were the native moments, right? And then they really decided to bring that out, and then other moments they just didn't have it at all. And so those aspects and avenues were, I remember them, but I don't feel like I gravitated towards that. And then I remember other distinct moments when it was really stereotypical, but I still I thought it was just really exciting. Gen 13 with the character Rainmaker, Sarah Rainmaker from that. As a 13-year-old boy, she's all hot and she's a lesbian, and that was exotic. And she's native, yeah! That was really exciting. But I can't remember growing up within the comic book realm anything that I gravitated towards of saying, that represents me, that's my identity. Also being Pueblo doesn't help in that aspect. There are not a lot of Pueblo characters because we're not the Plains Warriors or anything else like that. I'm the comic book that I would have read would have been and today's harvest was amazing, we grew some corn. That's not going to show up in a comic book, right? So, and I know there have been plenty of native characters in these comics, but there was never anybody that I grabbed onto more than Billy was Billy and Predator was the one I did.
That's a good example too.
Yeah.
That was a powerful scene too.
Yeah.
I remember that. So talk to me about Native Realities. What was your intent, or what is your intent with your press, and why did you start it?
So I have a career in education. I worked with Native youth for it's going on 20 years at this point, and Native communities, including my home community out of Laguna, which is where I started teaching. And one of the things that I recognized within those communities was really the lack of resources, literature resources, and especially scaffolding resources, right? So you have a lot of picture books, and then you have a sprinkling of YA, and then you literally just make this huge jump into adult literature. You're looking at Louise Erdrich, you're looking at, who am I thinking of? James Welch. This is stuff they're teaching in freshman and sophomore college classes. But because it's the only thing that's there, oftentimes, that's what we would back in and squeeze that into our high school classes and then 9 through 12 stuff. But there's a lot of kids that are not quite ready for that. And so there needs to be, what I kept recognizing, seeing, I kept looking around, I was I grew up with comic books. So many of us have. And where are those in terms of Native literature, where the Native existence, identity, and experience are the central premise of the story? That was what was missing. There was no sense, there were additional Native characters, which is great, but it's a lot of sidekickery, which I hate. And so it was very much missing, and I wanted to see that. And so, then that was just my educational background. And I've been working with Native writers for the last 15 years. My dad founded an organization called WordCraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. I grew up in that organization, so I know the majority of Native writers in the communities, and wanted to be able to access and engage them in a way that really focused on how do we change the world and change the perceptions of Native people utilizing popular culture. Because that's the way that I know how we access young people. Right? Whether it's forced on you because somebody thinks a comic book is good for you, or whether it's you just seeking it out because you walk into a shop like this and you're like, wait, there's this amazing Native character with 2 knives and can shoot fire from his hands on the cover of this thing, I gotta have that. So that for me was the big driving impulse to get us started. And there was there's some really keen comic book creators, Native comic book creators that came out of Phoenix ComicCon, where they were all meeting, including Arrogant Star, who is a lot of my partner in crime in a lot of this work. And she runs Super Indian, has been incredible at doing that, longest running Native comic book on the web, sort of over the span of time. She and I got together and started joking about creating a comic and images and things that we could put together, and it's developed into this going on almost 10 years that I've known her and worked with her as a colleague, as a mentor, and some of the work that she's accomplished. So it's been really profound, and now we get all this new generation. So we had there were two facets to why we started this. One was to get more stuff into the field of pop culture, because I believe that is the one way that we make change. The pop culture fight is the invisible war that nobody recognizes. When we think about structural racism, structural colonialism, and what's happened with young, Native people on reservation systems, is that overlaying all of this is a propaganda tool, right? That tells Native people that they're elements of the past, that their history stopped in 1890, that it's all cowboys and Indians, and that really no Natives exist anymore. And so that can lead to all sorts of things about land reclamation and isolation, marginalization, missing murdered Indigenous women, because of this popular culture element. So we're trying to change that. The second part is trying to professionalize the industry. Right? So for us, we want Native people to be able to have access to jobs at Marvel. I don't want our people to continue to be consultants, because that's the big thing with Native folks, and it partners up with the fact that we're all dead anyway, right, in quotes. So we come into this space and nobody wants to actually hire a Native person to write a mainstream comic book. They don't want to hire a Native person to illustrate a mainstream comic book, but we'll certainly bring you in to consult with us so that we make sure that we get the culture right. So we started this company so that emerging comic book artists and writers, Native, Indigenous, North, South, Central United States, and anywhere, could have the opportunity to sandbox, to cultivate their skills, to play with the stories that they want to play with, tell the stories that they want to play with, so they can develop their portfolio, so that when all of a sudden you see Marvel saying, or DC saying, well, we just don't know any Native people in the industry, we can point to dozens and say, here's your binder of Native people that are doing this, and they're good, and you need to hire them. Because this idea that you're giving us lip service about wanting diversity or culture needs to stop. We need people in the industry, and even more so for us is not only just like starting them in the space, but then moving them up along the line so they're in the executive positions, so that they can actually create that change in their spaces.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love that you just said that. Thank you so much. I completely agree. I think our listeners will agree with you as well. I mean, we're trying to educate people on getting more the Indigenous perspective across all mediums, all genres,
right.
Actually privileging that, right, and taking it out of the margins and putting it in the center.
Right.
And that's something that, as sort of white settler,
right.
That's not what we do, and we need to be doing that. We
right.
need to be doing that. And what you're talking about, the industries, I was wondering if you were trying to make inroads, because when I see what you're doing from the outside, it looks to me like you're trying to decolonize the medium.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know I'm throwing an academic word around, but
yes.
I mean, that's what I'm seeing. I mean, do you see yourself as sort of doing that?
From my academic perspective, that's exactly where I'm coming in
okay.
From the artistic and creative perspective, I look at it and say, like, there are so many great stories to tell. Why are we not telling the stories?
Yes.
Like, I don't think we need to come in. I do come in with very much an activist perspective and saying, like, listen, it needs to be equitable. It needs to have the access into the spaces. But I absolutely believe that the access is not determined by the identity, right? Simply because I'm Native, I shouldn't just be able to walk in. I need to be good. I need to be able to write. I need to be able to illustrate. And I got a bunch of people that can do that. That's the part about creating the access. The access is that there's a lot of people that are just being ignored. And I think that's what gets confused in a lot of the world, this identity world and these identity politics that we live in, is that it's as if we're coming in and saying, well, we just give us the handout or whatever like that. I'm like, no. I don't want a handout, but I want a seat at the table. I want a seat at the table so at least I get the opportunity to prove myself. And you know what? If I don't prove myself, then fine. That's on me. But I also, for me, because I'm an educator, it's about creating the training ground so that we can come in with the best possible, that the stories that we tell are the best possible stories, and that it's not one, we're not fighting over one piece of this pie. It's not a zero-sum game. There is room for all of this. There's room for some amazing stories, and when we ask and we say, hey, please don't keep telling cowboys and Indians over again, because I can point to a dozen or more, thousands of other really awesome stories about Native people in a modern identity, in a, whatever identity. I don't need to see Red Wolf where it's a native from the Cowboys and Indians again, in the future. So he's now, King Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court and native. And written, it's like we love Jeff Reggie, but written pretty terribly. And that's the part where like the pushback was like, well, natives are just going to hate it. I was like, yeah, we don't like it because our people we don't get to write it. We want to be able to write these stories. We want to be able to write our own stories, tell them in the way that we tell them. And for my company, for the work that I do, is working to and striving towards excellence, which is the standard, right? Which is how you work in the industry. So
it really is how you work in any industry. I mean, that's
exactly.
Absolutely. Okay, so the names.
Yes.
Native Realities,
Yep.
Red Planet.
Yep.
So this maybe is part of this intent.
Yes.
Right? These are very purposely. We talk about on the podcast sometimes naming. Naming is important, right? Language is important. It matters.
Yep.
And when you're talking about, Indigenous people want to represent yourselves through your own stories, your own ways, in excellent manner, but the language you chose for your company, for your store, it matters. Can you
Native Realities, I've owned Native Realities for almost going on 20, it's very close to 20 years at this point. It was one of the first online juried journals in the world. And we focused on Native writers. At the time, I was a 22-year-old writer that had graduated and, sending out my stuff and getting rejection upon rejection. And so I says, you know what, and I've always done this, I'm just going to create my own format so I can publish myself. But I didn't do that exclusively because in the meantime, what I did was say, well, let's get other Native writers, let's get all these great professionals that my dad has worked with, that I've grown up with, for 7+ years at this point, all these people that I've interacted with, and let's get their work out online. And so we ran, I think, for 2 to 3 years, quarterly. And I learned how to do web development. But the name came from my dad, so strikingly enough, because we were trying to figure out how we were going to name this new journal. And he was like, call it Native Realities. Like, my dad just loved to make names for things. So he's like, call it Native Realities. And I was like, well, that's interesting. He's like, because we're talking about the realities that Native people exist. How they're actually existing, not the mass media or stereotypical presentation of this, but what are the actual realities? And we show that through our poetry, through our stories, through our plays, etc. And so I've had that since 2000, since 99, 2000. It's been my email handle, it's been everything that we did. So when we started the company, I was like, well, I think this is Native Realities. I mean, essentially what we're doing is the same thing, and especially showing it now with the visual part. Red Planet actually came from my partner, who, when you heard the beep a little bit earlier, that's my business partner, Aaron Cuffey, just walked in. We were going back and forth, and we were getting real close to opening the shop. We didn't know what to name it, and I have to get the website up. We're trying to get the information out of there, and so we're like texting back and forth, and I'm like, what are we going to call this thing? Because we don't want to call it Native Realities as well, because we needed some separation, and we went back and forth. And he's popping through, and he's just like, sent me a text, and he's like, Red Planet. And I was like, that's it, Red Planet Books and Comics, because this is a red planet. This is where we exist in this, 80 by 20 space is an indigenous space. So it is Red Planet. Not only that, but then you add the science fiction elements of like Mars as the red planet, and there's other companies that have they're Red Planet. So we are actually Red Planet Books and Comics is the full title of this shop and the company. But yeah, it was just this wonderful stroke of brilliance and genius. And so then I was like, that's it, and developed the logo, and then we painted the side of the store. And
you had, I know you just told me this outside, because when I got here, of course, I immediately got Lee and said, oh, tell me about the outside, because the outside of your store is beautifully painted by a local artist.
Joseph Stacy's Pueblo from here. He's amazing. He's a great muralist and artist. I'm just thrilled that we were able to get him in and be able to paint the side of our building.
And there are some symbols on the outside. So there was one that's 505, and a cent mark, and I wondered what that was. And it is your area code?
It's the area code. So it's an identifying marker for the folks in Albuquerque. We're the 505. We call ourselves that. There's all sorts of representational. Plus the way the outside of the building looks is almost like an old comic book, where the price is on one side, so it's 505 cents. which was a nice little tongue-in-cheek type
Clever.
of thing with that. And then we were talking about on the other
Pueblo
side.
Batman and the
you have
1680. Please.
Again, like the comic books, you got the imprint and whatever, and so there's a little sort of design which is Pueblo Batman, and then underneath is circa 1680, which is looks like issue 1680 or number 1680, which is the date of the Pueblo Rebellion, which is really important for Pueblo people. And so this being Red Planet, especially since I'm Pueblo, Joe is Pueblo, it was a great way to and this is in Albuquerque's in Pueblo territory. So it was a way that we could do that indiginerd as well as, like Pueblo style nerd and represent who we are in this space. So
It's fantastic. I love
Yep.
it. And it's a beautiful frontage. I mean, it really is fantastic. I love it. Calling all high school and college teachers. You asked us for transcripts, resources, and advice on how to teach the subjects we talk about. We heard you and created Inside 254 teaching guides. High quality resources are expensive, and we know you don't have much money, so we priced our guides cheap. Nothing is more than $2 because we want to help you teach what we teach. Toxic Masculinity and the First Native American Myth-Busting Guide are now available, and more subjects will roll out as fall semester progresses. You get lecture notes in the form of a narrative transcript of our discussion of the subject, ready-to-print handouts of writing topics, discussion questions, and a bibliography resource list with active links that work. Go to teacherspayteachers.com or download the TPT app and search for Inside 254. Download your own Inside 254 teaching guide today. Let's shift over and talk about now Indigenous ComicCon, because I read an interview that you had done. You have a good story about the Denver ComicCon, I gather? Mm-hmm. Can you share that with us?
Which one? When we started with Denver ComicCon?
When you started.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, so Denver ComicCon, the first year we were invited for Denver ComicCon to be able to come up there, because we're the only Native company still that produces exclusively Native and Indigenous content. We don't produce anything else outside of that. A lot of other publishers do a little bit of sprinkling of everything, and we love to see anything coming out that has Native folks, but we produce this exclusively. So the first year we went up to Denver ComicCon, it was myself, Arrogant Star, and Marty Tubles. And I got up there the first day, and this is Comic-Con. Like, this is a big convention. The entire convention center, the trade floor's up. And we got this tiny booth, standard booth, 10 by 10. And on side of us, spreading up high to the ceiling is this company that's doing comics and this company that's doing toys. And I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. We are so underprepared for this entire experience. And we had one book at the time called INC's Universe, Indigenous Narratives Collective Universe, which was this collection of Native comic artists, all single pages. We put it together, and that's all we had. And we had boxes of it, but that's all we had. So we took this 8-foot table, and I just basically took the comic books and stretched them the entire way down the line. And at the time, Arrogant only had one comic book herself. She just had the Super Indian Anthology. So she had stacked those up on one corner, and I had brought up a whole bunch of stuff from my house, from my mom's house, pottery, and some Pueblo designs and various things, and our Pendleton, and kind of laid that out, tried to give us this thing, and I'd go running to Kinko's to make copies and these big posters and stuff. And so we wanted to put all that together, and that was the first experience that we had at a Comic-Con. And then we began to have conversations. And the conversations about the fact that when the INC folks came out of Phoenix, and the experiences that I was having, and then I'm reading online about the Native game designers, and they're going to their own singular conference, and the writers that I know that are doing genre work that are going to their own conferences, and the actors and television folks that are going to the film festivals. And I kept looking around being like, why are we not all in the same room? All of this work swirls around each other, and Native folks have to exist in multiple spaces. Elizabeth LaPonce, who did Dear Woman, not only is she a comic book artist, she's a fine artist, I put that in quotes because I think art is art, but she does, sequential art, she does, stationary art, she's a video game designer, she's a storyteller, she's you know, an
She's a
incredible
scholar.
writer. She's a scholar,
Right, she's
a
right.
professor.
Yes.
So because our communities are so small and because a lot of us take on multiple roles, we are often interconnected within various different genres and aspects. And so the idea that that we needed to create something. And there have been a few conversations, Eric and I were talking about this, talking about with some library folks about like, well, let's bring out some comic book people for this. And I sat down and said, well, I have a hole in the schedule in November. It's Native American Heritage Month. Let's go ahead and do it. And we picked a date, and we had some partners in town in Albuquerque here to be able to do that. I called up. First person I called up was Jeff Verreggi out of Seattle, and because he and I had a relationship, and asked him to be on board because he had a pretty, he had a high profile because he was doing Red Wolf at the time and his own work, and he agreed to be, let's say, our quote-unquote first guest. And that was in, I think, April of 2016. And we put the thing together in 8 months, the first ComicCon, and we had 1,000 plus about 1,200 folks that showed up that first year, 50 vendors, 20 plus guests, 3 full days of panels, workshops, cosplay, music, everything under the sun that you could think of. Kids area.
And that's and you held that
That was at the NHCC, National Hispanic Cultural Center,
okay.
that first year.
Okay, okay.
This last 2 years we've been, this coming up one, and the last year we had that at Isleta Pueblo Resort Casino. So they were gracious enough to be able to work with us on the space.
And it's grown.
And it's grown. Last year we had about 1,600 folks. We had 80 vendors. We had huge ballroom spaces, about 20-some guests again. It was, kids area, films, movies, panels, workshops, cosplay. Again, same kind of concept. This year we're going to be bridging into, we got a whole new interactive experience section called Electric Chaco, which we're going to do. We're imagining Chaco Canyon in a distant future, but really it's about fun and games, so that Chaco Canyon was about bringing everybody together. And so we've got a whole experiential piece that's going to go with that. You can walk through, there's going to be playing stuff, there's vendors, there's video games, where our video game section is going to be. There'll be some VR probably, and we have a fashion show, Indigenous Futurism's fashion show, working with young people on a concept called the Museum of Indigenous Imagination, where they do makerspace type stuff and just basically just put together some awesome like recycled fun maker material with engines and lights and motors and hot glue and soldering and all of that.
That's amazing. Have you been in, maybe I'm assuming too much, but have you been in contact with the Skins Workshop up in Canada? They're doing the game design workshops for Indigenous.
Potentially, I need to know the folks that were involved, but more than likely we know some of those particular folks, or at least we've had some peripheral contact.
Well, of course, now I'm wondering, this is growing and it's getting so much bigger and it's wonderful, and you want to make inroads and you want these bigger sort of companies like Marvel and DC and bigger to be, to recognize and to incorporate, Indigenous artists, designers, writers. Are they coming to attend even and learn?
We're getting getting notice, and we're getting a few folks that kind of come out. Folks that work in the industry are also a part of this, which is also great that they're not necessarily doing native-centric stuff all the time. They're industry professionals, which is exactly what they need to be doing, right? So they're not like an industry professional that's doing a native book. Mm-hmm. They're like, well, I write for this book, and my job is to illustrate that book. I'm not going to be throwing in, there's no native identity for this character. Mm-hmm. So you get folks like Jim Terry that come in, Tim Truman that come in, Wishoyo Avitre, who I work with on Six Killer. She's a professional. She's worked under Howard Chaykin. She knows IDW. They won an Eisner for, Little Nemo in Slumberland. They just won a Prism Award for her work with Dan and Heath Justice. We are working with industry folks, and I think we're continuing to get more and more notice as this goes forward. We just got we got one of the viral videos about the work. Now This put out a whole
I saw that
thing on
last
us.
week.
Last week. No, this week actually.
This week. It was
just
not that long ago,
Which is wild because, we get some good traction on our sites and things, I've watched things go around. It's just like 200,000 views.
That's incredible.
Up to this point, and I was like,
getting
wow.
the word out.
Well, and for me,
That's
I was like, man, why am I getting all, because I started getting pinged. And then the author, Mike Madden, hit me up. He's like, oh, we've gone live. He wasn't like a bag. He's like, we just went live. And I was like, oh, that explains why all of a sudden I'm getting all of these notifications. that makes more sense now in my life. Thank you, my friend. And then we posted about it. So
There's just so many wonderful stories. This is what I always tell our listeners, is this is a story you haven't heard before.
Right.
Because we as, settler culture, we are so, I guess, embedded with, our perspective
Sure.
on who Native peoples are, where they are, when they were, blah, 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 on and on, through the educational structure, through all the entertainment mediums, everything. And the one thing I love about what you're doing with all of these businesses and projects is it allows not just Indigenous peoples to see themselves represented. I want to say more accurately, but it's also, it's fantasy world too. But these are stories that are probably time-worn around kitchen tables and, a lot of Indigenous communities of stories you said that you want to tell. And they're stories that we as settlers have not heard before. And
Right.
they're incredible stories. They're great stories.
They're just great stories.
And they're beautifully, produced and written, and the artwork is incredible.
that's it.
It's worth spending your money on.
Yeah.
It's just a good story. You'd spend your money
I
on
agree.
any great story. I know you agree. So I know that literacy outreach is one of the side things. So just briefly, can you tell me some of the literacy outreach work that you're doing in the community?
Yeah, a lot of it is really just the outreach to schools. So for that scaffolding material. Teachers are really looking for this type of material now because they recognize the value of it. It's this whole shift. I'm sure it'll shift away because then everybody's going to say how comic books are terrible again. It's the pendulum. But right now, we're in a very much a pop culture age, and we will take full advantage of that. I don't believe it necessarily goes anywhere. It's like, we did swing dancing, and then we had the swing craze in the 90s. There's still swing dancing. There's a swing group here. It's well attended, here in Albuquerque. So I don't think it goes away. It's just how much emphasis we're putting on it. But we're going to utilize that, and it's a way to engage young people where they are in a visual medium to scaffold that type of literacy. So that you can say, okay, you've gone from picture books, there's some YA stuff that has, more basic language, early reader type of things, and then this really fast jump. So right in this middle section, it allows, a young person to come in and build concepts and build constructs around seeing the images. And if the image is told correctly and done appropriately, then you can actually see how the story develops, right? And then you can start picking out the words and seeing what's going on. And you develop a particular intellectualism and construct around comic book design and whatever. And so because of that, you get this, you get a space where educators can jump off of to be able to build a literary or a literacy base for their communities. Because it also helps, we know the studies, if you can recognize and represent yourself in that space, then you can kind of see where that, you're more likely to engage in it, right? It's not the given rule. It's not always going to happen. Kids and young people and adults are going to engage how they're going to engage, and they'd be like, I come in kids and just like comic books. I would rather read a metal magazine, and they'll do that. And I was like, great, read your magazine. So that's how we're approaching it.
Yeah. No, that's great. And finally, what is next on the horizon for you, for the con, for the press, for the store? What's upcoming?
So for the store, one of the things that we're really trying to do is expand the reach of the shop, and so we're developing a catalog currently. We are going to be doing indigenous-centric, native cultivated books, comic books, magazines that we can get out to schools, libraries, museums, anybody that's looking for specifically written by Native people, featuring Native people, that they can add to their curriculum. It's what we've heard, and when we've done our market research, what we've heard is it's very difficult for educators and for folks in these professional positions to try and find cultivated Native resources. You get a lot of folks that are writing Native stuff, and you'll see that in the catalog, and I believe there's a lot of value to non-Native written materials, but that's not what we do. We traffic in Native materials written by Native people, and because we want to privilege that. And it's just another element, it's just another facet, it's part of the marketplace of making it easier for folks to find the resources that they need. Plus there's some books that are not listed like at the front side of the catalogs anymore that still should be getting a run. I mean, something like, it's the 20th anniversary of Jingle Dancer by Cynthia Letty-Smith. I mean, that thing is still in production, it's still in print because everybody wants it. We want to be able to put that up into this catalog. So that's what Red Planet's running with. Indigenous ComicCon, third Indigenous ComicCon, November 2nd through the 4th. This year, Isleta Resort and Casino. We're also expanding globally. So I'm jetting off to Australia in the next few months to go in there and set the dates. So we'll be running an Indigenous ComicCon with our brothers and sisters over there in Melbourne, Australia. So we're going global. And then we have a couple of other expansion plans on the horizon, which we haven't announced yet, but keep an eye out for that. They will be coming very soon because we're going to be running, I think, 3 Indigenous ComicCons next year, including the one in Australia, as well as the one at home. So we're calling this one Prime now. We're going to steal from PAX and say this is PAX Prime.
Okay, I need to make
Indigenous
a request.
Comic-Con
Please
Prime.
come to the East Coast.
We're going to try.
I would love to have see you come an Indigenous Comic-Con on the East Coast. Yes.
We have some inroads, and so we're trying to work that out. So one of the things that were coming out of the company that we were discussing a little bit earlier, I was just out in Philadelphia. I'm working with the library company. They received a grant from the Pew Cultural Foundation, Pew Arts Center for the Arts, Pew Center for the Arts, to tell the story of the Paxton Massacre. So the Paxton Massacre happened in 1763, and essentially a bunch of raiders from Paxton, Pennsylvania, came out to the Conestoga Indian Territory, which is just outside of Lancaster, about 2-3 miles out of Lancaster, and massacred the group of native folks that were living there. Several of the tribal members that were there, because they're a whole, mix of communities, Susquehannocks, Lenape, like a whole bunch of folks that had sort of moved into that space. So there's not necessarily like a Conestoga tribe, but it was Conestoga Indian Township. And so the folks that were in Lancaster, they were all moved into the workhouse. And after Christmas, when they were still doing celebrations, the Paxton murderers came out there and finished the job, killing off the rest of the Conestoga Indians. There was another 14 that were there. They were basically just led into the workhouse and they were killed. This is a decade before the 1776 and the independence movement for American independence. And so a lot of the things that you see, this is really America does things by precursor. So a lot of the language that you see about why the Paxton murderers were really, upset about everything, about these merciless Indian savages on their borders, on the frontier, because they were frontiersmen, essentially, frontiers folks, and so they were dealing in the middle of the Indian Wars. But rather than fighting, the folks that could actually fight back, they went and murdered a whole bunch of men, women, older men, women, and children to show how angry they were. And so there's a bunch of history around that that's never been told. And again, these stories that need to be heard, so that we can reconcile our histories, so that we can reconcile the fact that this was not part of a frontier fight. We understand that there were battles and that we know that happens, but this was straight up murder. This is something that shouldn't be allowed, but it also has echoes throughout American history. And as American people, as half American, whatever we want to categorize me as, the idea that we have to reconcile our history, that it should be out there, and using a medium like graphic novels and pop culture is really important. So we just got back from Philly, we're working on that. Hero Twins #2, Tribal Force #2, Six Killer #2 at some point. What else? We'll have Anthology #2, so that's our, we'll be sort of collecting and cultivating things. We're working with Jonathan Nelson on The Wool of Jonesy and trying to get the rest of that story out there, so we're very excited about that. And then we've just got a bunch of other stuff in the pipe, got some digital media stuff that we're coming out with, so it's amazing. Games, we're doing some game design type of research, so it's really exciting, and it's a bold and an incredible future.
That's wonderful. It's a good time. It's a good time to be you.
It's a good time to work in a comic shop. People are like, "What do you do?" I was like, "I make comics." I don't tell the adults that. The kids love that. When I go to the Apple store, they love that too. And the adults ask them, they're like, "What do you do?" I'm like, "I publish." And they're like, "Ooh, that's amazing." Very respectable. Very respectable.
Right. But you make comics.
But I make comics.
And it is good.
Yeah,
it
comics,
is very
games,
good.
toys, collectibles. That's what we do here.
That's fantastic. So if folks want to come and buy some comics that are created by Indigenous makers and books, you can go to nativerealities.com.
Nativerealities.com,
Or
Red Planet Books ABQ, redplanetbooksabq.com. We will have our catalog up here hopefully within the next couple of weeks.
Excellent.
So just stay tuned. We're getting there as fast as we can. It takes a lot to chronicle books, and get all the relevant information up in this space. But we're working on it. But in the meantime, visit nativerealities.com, and you can find everything that we produce. We got a lot of fun stuff.
And if you're in the Albuquerque area, if you're coming through, come down to Red Planet Books and Comics and actually come to the store. It's a pretty cool place. It's a great frontage. It's a wonderful space in here. It is worth visiting as well. And you can also follow Lee on Twitter at Lee Francis
IV. Francis 4. Francis IV.
And Lee, thank you so much for spending time with me and for talking about this. All your
pleasure.
Wonderful work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this Expert Extra. For more information on our podcast and to find episodes, please visit Inside254 site, that's site.wordpress.com. You can find us on Podbean and iTunes, and please follow us on Facebook and Twitter for all the latest. Thanks for listening.